Good morning, everybody. Morning. Gosh, this has been my, fourth trip to this place in 1 year, to this museum. But the last time I was here facilitating a learning day for the Museums and Active Citizenship project, there was an exhibition on India. I'm not sure whether I was asked to facilitate the learning day here because they had an exhibition on India, and they essentialized me as an Indian, but I'm an Australian. Just like you saw Crown Princess Mary there from Tasmania. By the way, Tasmania is in Australia because people sometimes correct me by saying, she's not from Australia, she's from Tasmania. And it's another state of Australia. 229 people here, and 80%, or nearly 80% women in this audience. I was going through your profiles and who's registered. And of course, Thomas would like more women teachers. And I think in museums, maybe we need more men actually actively engaging, not just making decisions at the top. Because the workers are here, most of the workers. And I think it's a major issue that in my short stay as a migrant in Denmark from Australia, that I noticed is that there needs to be some fundamental transformation in cultural leadership and decision making. And I'm still learning, and as an outsider. And I found, how many of you been to Thomas's museum? Put your hands up. Wow, fantastic. You know why they're popular, right? Because you actually experience something. If I did the same thing with Sovereign Hill in Australia, everybody puts their hand up because it's experience. And so experiential learning is something that we all cherish. But how do we deal with transformations? How do we deal with change? And how do we deal with that shift from being, once upon a time curiosity cabinets, and now, we all say inclusive. But what do we mean by inclusive? What do we mean by active citizenship? How well are we engaged? Inclusion is a very sexy word I found out in Denmark. And everybody likes to say inclusive. Now it's inclusive design, inclusive planning, inclusive cruises for exclusive people. So it's fascinating how we pick up the jargon. And I still remember there was a time when cultural diversity became the rhetoric, that across the world people were struggling with it. How to contextualize it within their own institutions. So the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Robert McAdams, in a staff address, he said, cultural diversity is like a salad bowl, sort of everything has to be crisp and nice, individually appreciated. The Canadians, who probably have the only country other than India and South Africa to have something legally mandated to deal with inclusion, call it a mosaic, because their legislation actually emphasizes that in order to appreciate inclusion, you have to respect diversity and facilitate diversity. Whereas Australia, which for a long time had White Australia policy, and focuses on the fabric, because the emphasis for a long time has been on assimilation, not integration. Integration is a more recent word. But in most countries in Europe, integration is a word that's used for assimilation. And so when South Africa went to make a bid for Olympics, this is Cape Town Olympics, which they didn't win. And so when South Africa bid for the Olympics, their cultural Olympiad opening line said, Cape Town is a mixed masala of cultures. Masala, spices, sort of cultures. And then, of course, we're all used to hearing the melting pot. We are a melting pot. But few people realize melting pot has got nothing to do with food. Because remember, it's cultural pizza, mixed masala of cultures, mosaic, fabric, and salad bowl multiculturalism. But melting pot is actually from Detroit. When the Ford factory in the 1920s started getting, after the First World War, large number of people coming from Europe, and there were Hungarians bringing their salami, Italians bringing their pizzas, and they're coming from all these different countries. And they're dressed really weird, so the manager, the foreman, of the factory line, he thought this is really not nice. We have to do something about it. So he created a huge dressing room in the shape of a cauldron. So when people came into work from one end, they came in as Italians, Croatians, whatever, dressed Hungarians, dressed different with their lunch boxes. They changed into the blue overalls that we all use now. And when they came out at the other end, they all came out as Americans. And that's the melting pot, So what is it that we do, when we're talking about inclusion, when we get diversity of people? And this diversity doesn't necessarily mean ethno-specific diversity. Diversity could mean many things to many people. It could be racial, it could be ethnic, it could be cultural, it could be your sexual orientation, it could be gender, it could be faith, it could be your economic status, it could be your regionalism, like, I often hear about Denmark and its regional, tensions that are there. I mean, if you're a kid, like and at least two people I know here from Copenhagen who went to school in Northern Jutland, you got beaten up at high school. You're a bloody city, girl, sort of. So there's this kind of regional tensions here, across the world we deal with. So there are many cultural borders when we talk about cultural diversity, but we often tend to focus on visual minorities. We focus on visual minorities because it's easier to essentialize them, like Indian, It's easier to identify. But do we really exist as migrants in isolation? We don't. And if somebody calls me an Indian, what does it mean? After 33 years in Australia. And so trying to understand the population profile, trying to map the cultural borders that we all negotiate, all of us. None of us are essentially one thing, we are many peoples. But trying to negotiate the many peoples, is fairly critical. And how do museums actually mediate their spaces in such a way that individually as people, sort of engage with museums? How can they as communities, and how can they engage as individuals? And as Thomas was mentioning, by the way, I just love that museum, Thomas. I think it's fantastic. And if you learn a lot from theme parks, it's fine, I think at the end of the day, one thing we learn to do is we learn to present, talk, and learn to tell stories. And not all of us are good storytellers, but I think that's a skill that we don't teach in our university museum studies programs. Forget our teacher training programs. And but some of you, how many of you heard about the Inclusive Museum Conference? Oh, that's great. Thank you. So it's the first activity that I was involved as a migrant over here at the National Art Gallery. People from 48 countries, and dealing with inclusion. One of the questions that I constantly get asked is, how do you define an inclusive museum? What do you mean by it? I said, no, we don't define, because defining is containing. It's an open-ended dialogue. When you're dealing with cultural diversity, we need to negotiate the discourse in such a way that it is all inclusive. But in some ways, I often quote Mandela when in 1964, after the Vienna trials, that he was interviewed, he said, South Africa is for all South Africans. Remember, the country has 11 official constitutionally gazetted languages, plus a whole lot of the other diversity. And in 1994, on the 10th of May, during an inaugural speech in Pretoria at the Union Square, he thundered by saying, let there be water, let there be land, and let there be salt for all people of South Africa. And his government of national unity was for all South Africans. So inclusion is for all of us. It's not just visible minorities and dealing with people out there, but the way Thomas has been dealing with is that totality of experience, as he called it, but at the same time, within that totality of experience, while we recognize that cultural diversity is a historical reality and a contemporary reality, because of a whole range of practices, both within the country and outside the country, the inequities, legacies, And as a result of those inequities and legacies, that we need to make interventions like they do in the museum, with people who are disadvantaged otherwise if you lump them all together. But it doesn't mean that they're any less capable as visitors, as participants in exploring the sense of place and identity of themselves as Danish people or from wherever they come. And Ida used this, not fair, because I went and scanned this. Because the one thing, this is my first, going to this conference last year, and then, working out, what's come out in the user survey. It's about intergenerational dialogue. It's about intergenerational transmission. But there is a generation which naturally is inclusive because they go to school in very multicultural environments. They grow up in a media environment which is very multicultural. They engage in a Twitter, world that's very inclusive. I mean, when Rick West at the Inclusive Museum Conference quoted Stephen Weil, that museums are safe places for unsafe ideas, it was somebody tweeted, not one person actually, 6 people tweeted from the audience. And then it got retweeted. So there are 33,637, I think, people who actually got the message that museums are safe places for unsafe ideas. We got a generation there that can really open up our museum, but do we know how to engage with them? That's the key issue. Because nobody teaches in our university programs the competency of learning, listening, I mean, so the competency of listening. But we have to listen, but how do we listen? I mean, how many of us are really tolerant of our teenage children? We just say, oh, bloody teenagers, but do we, it is a struggle to learn to listen. So here, with the citizenship project, what I learned from the 32 people that met here in Aachen is that citizenship anticipates processes of inclusion through active participation. And I'm not saying just educational programming and public programming, but also your collections. Because I still remember when Australia had the first community access gallery at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. There's a bit of space there. All these migrants, you can come, we'll help you with our design staff and everything. Every month, one of you can have a space and create your own community-based exhibition. So after going on for 10 years like this, we did an evaluation. And we found that nothing changed in the collections. Nothing changed in the staffing. So we asked the director, so what's happening here? And the reply we got is, oh, that space is with them. We're talking about 60% of the population in Melbourne. It's the second largest Greek city in the world after Athens. That space is for them. But the collections and everything is us. So the binary, the tyranny of the binary discourse continues to haunt us. And so it is active engagement at a global level in the sense, when you engage with somebody these days, a young person, could be Caucasian, white, young Dane, born in Copenhagen, never been anywhere. But his or her world is very global through the multimedia. They engage incredibly, rich resources. So when we try to engage with people, we got to think of the global context, not just the local context. Synergies in collaborative collective action through strategic and relevant partnerships. We're not good at working in partnerships across the world because we're all competing for the same cake. And so some countries have actually introduced projects where unless you collaborate and demonstrate you're collaborating, you don't get the money. So the cake is divided by your capacity to work together in relevant partnerships. But spaces as, museums as civic spaces for mediation, to reflect and reveal and confront, that's where intercultural dialogue becomes critical. And to promote mutual respect and reconciliation of differences. But museums can't be all things to all people. That's what Michael O'Ryan, the president of ICOM Ireland, said on many occasions. He was the director of the Batty Library, a former director. And but we shouldn't try to be all things to all people. But where we try to find our relevance is through mapping our stakeholders, working out a stakeholder participation framework and establishing an ethical, context, the way we engage with our stakeholders. One of the issues that we find very often with refugees across the world is, today it's Afghans, so we are the National Museum, we have historical objects, we're going to work with Afghan refugees today. So they do an exhibition during the Refugee Week, International Refugee Week. But the next year, those Afghans don't come back to the museum, and people question, hey, why aren't they coming back? Well, what do they see as relevant? You saw them as relevant for you in the Refugee Week, but did they see your museum as being relevant to you? I mean, these are serious issues. And the convergence of communications, and I can tell you, during the International Year of Tolerance, Australia had a huge budget, this was several years ago, for museums. And the entire budget was not spent till about May. 30th of June is the end of the financial year. So there was panic. So they went to the National Museum of Australia, which was not yet open, but had all the collections and facilities and access to the old Parliament House. Said, you can have all the money, but we've got 5 weeks, we want you to do an exhibition on tolerance. And I still remember, because I was first-hand witness, the director going through the story, we'll have that. Oh, that's Hungarian, that's from Baltic states, Lithuanian, Latvian, displaced people, yes, that's good. We're a very tolerant country in Australia, we should show how we've been tolerant. And then they hired an outside company, and they did an exhibition in 5 weeks. But nearly $600,000 of that budget went to one company to create a digital program where young people could come into the exhibition, click on a mouse, and they could connect with the young people around the world, a project that was being facilitated by UNESCO. What happened? The minister walked up, gave the speech, opened the exhibition, went up and clicked on the mouse, nothing happened. And nothing ever happened. Because that company said, sorry, these are your specifications that you gave, we did what you wanted. If you want us to change, it's going to cost you another $200,000. And so one lesson from that I always raise is, we outsource a lot in museums these days, but when we outsource, do we actually have the competency within the museum to outsource and engage with the agents from outside? Do we have that? And I think it's a major issue, because more and more people tend to outsource and diminish their internal capacity in museums to engage in the digital domain. So, but when you're talking about citizenship, it's very similar, you've got to make sure your staffing itself is culturally and linguistically diverse and is able to understand that diversity, not from a monolingual, monocultural point of view, because it doesn't matter how much you try to discuss and show empathy, it doesn't work, because at the end of the day, you bring in, as the authority of the museum, your own perspective. And this is one of the reasons why so many multicultural projects are not sustainable. So what happened, you all got the ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter at the end of your program that you've got, the 10 principles, got them in English, French, and Spanish. And not that I speak French or Spanish, but that's the ICOM, 3 official languages like UNESCO. And this charter, it took about several years to work on this charter, and it was finally adopted by 127 countries present, but in reality 167 countries in Shanghai at the ICOM Triennial General Conference, where there were several of you participating in Shanghai in one of the resolutions. And I'll quickly take you through this charter and finish, so that we have an exercise at the end of this session. And I want you to think about it, because one of the things, please forgive me, I'm still a new Dane, becoming Copenhagener. I'm still not in the, one day I'll be in that exhibition, the professor who came to Copenhagen at the Museum of Copenhagen. But so forgive me if I'm stirring you up, because I believe the purpose of keynote speakers is to raise questions and stir. I mean, you are the experts. I mean, collectively, you are the Danish museum industry, museum encyclopedia of knowledges that you all embody in this theater. So I'm nobody to say this, but I want to raise certain issues as we go along. Because inclusion, we immediately think, the agency has got budget for this, let's go and do this. So you write your thing and you do it. But it doesn't work, it's not sustainable in the long term. But the more and more the agency does projects like the one that's just been presented at the beginning, the more and more accountable you'll become, the more and more you will be put under the microscope to the public, not to the agency, but to the public, because it's all published and available. So that's why the charter becomes very important. First of all, diversity. There are 10 principles, and first of all, diversity. Why we focused as the first principle of diversity? What are the challenges of the 21st century, right? Remember 2000, 31st December 1999, start of just at midnight, we were all there, champagne and everything, celebrating parties, but we were all very nervous because everybody said our computers are going to stop and the whole world is going to come to an end. I mean, the neurosis across the world, it doesn't matter where. That's how we started. That's how we started. And then we found 1 minute past 12, everything was still working. Hallelujah, we've been saved. And come September 11th, 2001, we were shocked. We were shocked that the most powerful country in the world could be attacked in a devastating way. I didn't know that till September 13th because I was in Vietnam, and you have 3,900 people that died in the Twin Towers. We lost 21,000 people in southern China and northern Vietnam in some of the worst floods. I was stranded in the floods. But you probably never heard that so many people died in Vietnam and southern China. But Americans were attacked. Americans died. It became a global catastrophe. And we went and carpet bombed Afghanistan while the Afghans were telling us that Osama bin Laden is actually in Pakistan. He's not here, but we never listened. And finally we found him there. So what happened in the early years, the last decade and a half? War and terrorism, lack of tolerance, anybody who looked different was, somebody, you remember the Bush rhetoric that you're either with us or with the enemy, right? So you had to be with us, you were not allowed to question. And I was appointed to the National Program Committee of the American Association of Museums in 2001 because they said, AAM is very inward looking, we want you to be a critique of our national program. And it was shocking. We met in Portland, Oregon, where our two keynote speakers come from. And the program committee, we were shocked. How few people, for the first time, compared to the previous years, nominated papers and sessions dealing with diversity. Hardly any African Americans. Why? Everybody was scared. Either you're with us or with the enemy. So we had to make special interventions to nominate sessions and African Americans, believe it or not. I, as an Indian-educated Australian advising, had to nominate. I mean, that's how ridiculous the situation was. Why? Because we became very neurotic. We were very scared. And now, it is within that context we start becoming conscious about the preciousness of human existence, preciousness of human culture in all forms. And what happens? 11th of September, 2001, United States of America gets attacked. Global war was declared on terrorism. But what happened on 2nd of November 2001? Anybody? Yeah? It happens to be my birthday, but that's immaterial. But 2nd of November. You remember 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights after the Second World War. Denmark adopted it, but not many countries did. Because a lot of countries felt the Second World War and European experience is being loaded onto the rest of the world. But on 2nd of November 2001, the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity was adopted by every country of the world. So in fact, our sense of insecurity, actually drove us to accept cultural diversity is a reality. And that that's where intercultural dialogue became a strategy for UNESCO, for all the UN system. Every country, started using intercultural dialogue. We need to have intercultural dialogue to facilitate, greater understanding between communities, between people, so that we can promote peace and understanding. So the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, but also if you come from Australia, and I'm sure you have this challenge here too, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, which is increasingly becoming the benchmark to see, to what extent are we engaged with the historical and contemporary realities in our countries. And the ICOM strategic plan is based on that. So the ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter, came out of this process of Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity. For 6 years, from 2004 to 2010, I was asked to chair a task force with members from across the world to work through a process whereby come up with principles which are axiomatic, which means they're not negotiable, but on the other hand, they can be used for evaluating yourselves, benchmarking what you're trying to do in this area. So the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, and you find in the principle, biological diversity is also mentioned. You know why? Because the action plan for the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity was launched at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, dealing with environmental sustainability in many ways. We're trying to look at culture within that context, arguing that the nature-culture dichotomy is a false colonial dichotomy. In Africa, there is no word for heritage. I mean, if you are, the reason I'm walking here is apart from looking at you all, also to keep an eye on the watch. And, but in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, there's no word for heritage. But in a lot of languages, like for instance in Zulu, you say Amasiko, and in Shangaan, you say Ditso, and in Venda, you say Maflele. But in all these languages, you got something that is relevant for us when we're talking about heritage, and that is we are who we are because we breathe through our ancestors. Very much like the Maori in New Zealand, And so when in post-apartheid South Africa, I lived there for 5 years working on restructuring museums, but we also worked with the SADC countries, Botswana to Zimbabwe and Zambia. And when we actually did focus groups, people say, look at, because I was using a PowerPoint presentation, that, objects and sites are like PowerPoint presentations, but we live our heritage. They're like PowerPoint presentations. You're trying to preserve that, but you're not preserving the living heritage. Thomas, you're trying to do both, trying to take an integrated approach, which is fantastic. And so that's why in the first principle, you find both. Now the thing is that 1972, the ICOM General Conference in Santiago de Chile adopted the declaration, and it's called the Santiago de Chile Declaration of ICOM, which promoted within the context of Council of Europe in the 70s. Those of you who are old enough like me know that in 1970s, cultural democracy was the big thing in Europe. The Council of Europe published extensively. If you ask me, where can we get hold of this? Good luck. We have what is called cultural amnesia in museums. We produce, but then we don't realize what we produced. We try to reinvent the wheel. But participatory democracy is something became, almost a passion in Europe. And it's within this context, I just want to say how complex it is. This is from the National Museum of Ethnology in Leiden, Netherlands, which is one of the oldest ethnology museums in Europe. The Dutch government put enormous amount of money into the Delta Plan for conservation and collections management. It's the first museum to digitize its collections. But it's also the museum that got 60 million euros to redo the inside of the museum to make it a contemporary museum. Very design-driven, fantastic to go in there. And what they did was, they did a ribbon around the world. So the Dutch were there. That's the Dutch colonial expansion. So wherever the Dutch were there, the collections are here in Leiden. So all the galleries were based on the ribbon around the world. There was a wall that went through the whole all the galleries. On the wall you had the ribbon with stories and everything. In between you had the treasures, if you will. But what happened when they opened in early 2000? After all this money was spent, they had 20,000 people come through the front door. The Dutch parliament hit the roof, saying, why did we spend so much money when people aren't coming in? And I was very fortunate then to be brought in for 4 years, and I moved. I mean, I say I'm an Australian, but I moved, like right now I'm in Denmark. For 4 years, what we did was, so see, there is the wall ribbon that goes around the wall, and then the treasures that you find, and the outcomes of the Delta plan, every object conserved, digitized in the new storage area. But what happened is, the Dutch were there, so the collections are here. But they forgot that the Dutch were there, so the people are here. The Netherlands being, only ahead of Denmark in the largest number of slaves that they transported, have a lot of descendants. And so they didn't take that into consideration. Indonesia is like the crown jewel for Netherlands. So a lot of Indonesians, Moluccans, Surinamese. So the Dutch population is so culturally and linguistically diverse, but they didn't connect the collections, communities, and the source countries. So my job was very easy. For every curator, I had X amount of money. Do the triangulation. You got your exhibitions, but we had temporary galleries at the back of every major gallery. Here's the temporary money, but you have to come up with the methodology of sitting down, talking to people and working with them. How do you bring them together? And, but also the important thing about digitization, I'll come back to with the final point. Remember, Netherlands, cooperation and coordination. How much cooperation and coordination can they achieve? It's phenomenal. This is the only eco-museum which is a national museum in the world. It's in Vietnam. It's a national museum, but it's an eco-museum. We have eco-museums in Nordic countries, quite a lot, but none of them are national museums. Most of them are dying, basically. What was the neighborhood museum, for example, even in Netherlands, in Amsterdam has become, now the design district where there's women, standing in display cases and soliciting. Well, that used to be an eco-museum in the 70s and 80s. And but what happened over here is, when it was inscribed on the World Heritage List, Halong Bay, how many of you have seen Indochine, the film? Catherine Deneuve, yay, that's great. And how many of you have seen Nobody Runs Forever, the James Bond film? Oh, I know we all love Catherine Deneuve. She still looks gorgeous. And she comes there to Halong Bay. And if you want to have lunch with her, come there while we run our field school, because she does come occasionally join us. But don't propose to her, because she has a manager next to her who will take you away. And but what happened is, when it was inscribed on the World Heritage List, in 1994 they had 120 visitors. Last year it's 2.3 million. And but it's one of the most devastated places in Vietnam. It was carpet bombed by the Americans during the war. But it was also destroyed during the French times, because 91% of coal came from Halong Bay, hinterland of Halong Bay. That's why the French were there in the first place. But nobody told the layers of history. And so what happened is, there was an intervention to bring people and their heritage together. Eco-museology is a tool to bring people and their heritage together. And that's what we were trying to do. And in doing that, we found there were 10,000 people who live on the sea. In the old days, they were called sea gypsies. These days, it's not politically correct. But, and the recommendation from two scientists from a Western country was sedentarize them, because we need to keep everything clean and pure on Halong Bay. So there was a rebellion in a communist country, if you will. And there was a transformation that came out of it. That is the Halong Eco Museum. And one of the 13 projects is the world's first floating museum on the sea. That's 19 kilometers from mainland. in the background, you see a limestone cast coming out of the sea. That provides the leeward side, like Copenhagen is located here because it's the leeward side, with the sea breeze and everything. And it's the leeward side, that's why it's built over there. And it's entirely built, by local people themselves. I was the only foreigner there, as you can see, fat and getting old, because I was eating so many prawns every day on the sea. And but what you find over here is what we did was, what does it take? What are the skills and competencies for building a museum? What are the skills and competencies do the actual people, the custodians, have? We did a gap analysis, and it took me 3.5 years to do the capacity building. I used to go there regularly, then my master's and PhD students would stay back, so we would every second month, work through this. And in the end, they built it themselves with the help of Vietnamese Navy, and they take ownership for this museum. So remember one thing, although I'm supposed to work on a new master's program in inclusive museum studies, not everybody needs a master's in museum studies to build a museum and run a museum, because it's one of the most successful museums in Southeast Asia. And they made their first 3-year budget within 6 weeks, because people want to come to experience through the eyes of the Vietnamese fishing communities, about their heritage and the layers of history. Thomas was talking about, as he took us through the layers of significance, layers of history, layers of significance of collection, stories, to the present day. Then people, can understand their sense of place here and now. And that's what's happening over here. Peace and community building, these are easy things to say. I mean, the Armory Museum over here has an excellent exhibition on Afghanistan. And a lot of my museum colleagues who've been there, they say, oh my God, it was a shocking exhibition, this and that. But I like it. I've been working in Afghanistan more recently, and I think of all those mothers, all those brothers and sisters who lost their loved ones, young people, 21, 22-year-olds who've been sent to Afghanistan, to Helmand province to fight. And they die, And this exhibition actually opens up, the primary audience that I saw, and is that those people, those Danes who've been affected in this, and this is where museums become fairly critical, not to just glorify war, but also create spaces where there's healing, where there's understanding for the grieving, of the mothers that you see going to the exhibition, the parents, the brothers and sisters, the girlfriends, because most of them are boys, girlfriends going to that exhibition. But what is this? This is from the National Museum in Hanoi. It's living with the sacrament. It's about Catholics in Vietnam. Because what happened when the French came, the Catholics took the land from the peasants, tried to forcibly convert them to Catholicism, but confiscated their land. When the communists came, I know this is going on YouTube, all my Vietnamese colleagues, they know this is how I talk, and this is how I was talking at the opening of exhibition, because remember, it's a socialist country, and I still need a visa to go back, and I will get it. And but what happened is the communists came, they took the land from the Catholics and gave it back to the peasants. But now with Doi Moi reforms, or the Vietnamese equivalent of perestroika, and I've got 4 minutes because we started 4 minutes late, I'll finish. And the perestroika equivalent, it's called Doi Moi reforms. Vietnam is opening up. It's one of the fastest growing countries in the region. In fact, it's going to be one of the first countries in the world which started as very poor, but there's an exit strategy for this country with donors. All donors will leave in the next 3 years. They don't need donors. And so this exhibition, yes, museums have safe places for unsafe ideas. And I deliberately, I was there to speak, and training people, working with them, how do you deal with this? It's layers of history. But what we did was we actually engaged throughout. It was based on the notion of co-curatorship, bringing people together into the museum, paying them as co-curators, letting them bring their own objects, letting them tell their own stories within a museum context, but at the same time not being tokenistic and patronizing, but working together. providing multiple perspectives. Now what happens? Look at this. Can you see from there at the back? The army. We had so many police and army at the opening. We provided fantastic free dinner for the opening. Another reason they could have been there. But really, what they came there is, which we didn't know, there's a certain amount of nervousness that we could all be arrested, was a turning point, like how you need to understand your audience. They all came because their captains and generals felt it's a fantastic opportunity to understand some of the issues that we're dealing with in our country. So they saw it as a professional development opportunity. And we ran training programs for them afterwards. But it's about the role of museums in peace and community building. And this is another example. National Museum in Phnom Penh, you have these young Buddhist monks coming in. They come and play in the lotus pond. But you have all this very colonial museum where the objects, like hallmark of Orientalism, with minimal caption presented, Buddha, Gandhara Buddha, Angkor Buddha, sort of 7th century AD, minimal caption, making no sense to the local people. But trying to open up the museum after the Pol Pot regime, the killing fields, how to use Buddhism through these monks, because predominantly Buddhist country, in using the museum space for healing. And this is the largest and the only mosque in the world that's entirely built of wood, and the entire Quran, because you cannot write the Quran in any other language other than Arabic or script. But it's the only mosque in the world where it's written bilingually in Chinese and Arabic script. The entire Quran, it's entirely made of wood. It's in Xi'an. Remember Istanbul and Xi'an, the two nodes of the Silk Road. And, but how it's being used by the Chinese, because in another 9 years, it's not Indonesia which will have the largest Muslim population, it's China. So they're dealing with the whole transformations that they have to address. And I won't go into Robert Louis Stevenson there, from his house, Walimai, in Samoa, and how it's being used, we all read. How many of you read Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson? Well, that's where he wrote. That's his bedroom where he died with TB. But trying to use it in another way, the museum, to bring people, and the colonial legacies together. Innovation and inspiration. I had to put this in because Thomas's presentation, with people with dementia. And this, I was teaching, I was young there, I was teaching a course for master students and doing a master class. These are all the master students in the National Museum, New Delhi. The exhibition is called Ihsas. It's done inside the National Museum by the students. And Ihsas means senses. And next to me is the president of the National Blind Association of India. And he wears glasses. And I said, can you see a little bit? He said, no. Why do you wear glasses? Well, why can't blind people wear glasses? Who am I to question that? But he's the president of the National Blind Association. So the students, masters and PhD students, worked with the National Blind Association as a strategic partner in creating an exhibition right inside the National Museum. But people who cannot see, the other senses, they can hear, they can smell, they can touch, they can taste. Those senses are enhanced enormously. So it's actually, working on the senses, that they had. And this is where I've just finished my recent work in Bamiyan. Remember the two Bamiyan Buddhas that were blown up by the Taliban? Okay, those are the niches. It cost $7.6 million to stabilize the niches because there are a lot of murals over there. These are all potato fields here because Bamiyan potatoes are world famous. And what we're doing over there is building. We found a sleeping Buddha. I'm watching. Thank you. And we built, there's a sleeping Buddha we found, but we reburied, until we build a new museum. Guess where the money is coming from for this museum? From Italy. And everybody says there must be German money, really. But Italy is giving 2.5 million, Japan is giving 2.5 million. but a site museum entirely through the local Hazara people. Unlike the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were safeguarded as global heritage, but local people were not involved. But this museum is entirely going to be built like the Vietnam one by the local people. Capacity building, one of the things is when we talk about inclusion, do we really have the capacity to deal with inclusion? Do we really have the capacity to deal with cultural diversity? It's a project I did for Australia through Prime Minister and Cabinet because they wanted me to do a national review. It took me 3 years almost. And out of that came guidelines on transformation and capacity building, which informed Australian museums and art galleries for nearly 15 years. But the most important thing is, this is a project I did for the Australian Local Government Association. The Swedes have used it extensively. First they piloted it in Gotland, and then they used it extensively. The rationale behind this whole project is, we have all these local governments. In every local government you provide a service, educational service, health service, and we, based on the service charter, what we did was, we used the same principle for cultural services and museums, that it is a service that linked up with health and well-being. So the number of projects where the health department actually supports a local museum, working with elderly people, working with people with dementia, Alzheimer's, it's phenomenal. And it's the same with HIV/AIDS, not all that long ago. So it's policy-based approach. Productive diversity, good inclusion is good business. Cultural diversity is good business. We spend something like $6.8 billion a year in Australia to keep 25,000 people behind the walls as prisoners. This is a project with my students, master's and PhD students, I did with the guy in charge of the prison who is also a student of mine. We did everything inside, trained the prisoners, and they built the world's, according to ICOM, world's first ever museum that has been built and run by prisoners themselves. It's actually built by them. And they take total ownership and they run it. It's booked out for school groups for 2 years. Why a lot of high school teachers feel kids learn more about drugs from the prisoners than they learn from their teachers, and they stop taking drugs. And that's one of the motivations for them why it's so popular. But the thing is, we're saving a lot of money for correctional services because the rehabilitation process is phenomenal. Before we had 91% people coming back into the system, but now it's negligible. In fact, none of them come back because they're finding themselves through their self-esteem in the outside world. By the way, in fact, Australia could do better, put all the prisoners in Hyatt Hotel, and they'll save at least $1 billion, plus the prisoners won't run away. And I think prisons are a bad thing. And so we need to think about museum economics when we're talking about, I gave you an extreme example, but we're not necessarily engaged in the economics of sustainability. Standard setting, there's a whole range of charters and conventions of UNESCO that coming out, but let me tell you one thing. Last week, UNESCO Executive Board made a decision that there's going to be a new declaration on museums. It's going to be a UNESCO Declaration on Museums. And, but it's very much going to focus on contemporary museums and some of the issues that you're going to discuss over here. So please keep an eye on the UNESCO webpage. Sustainability and climate change. Next year, Copenhagen is the green city. 2025, Copenhagen will be the first carbon neutral city in the world. What does it mean? When your economy is dependent upon ships all over the world, what is the carbon footprint of those ships and around the world? Not carbon footprint of your public transport in Copenhagen. So we live in a globalized world and we need to deal with the impacts elsewhere. But this is from the World Commission for Culture and Development. It doesn't matter whether we're dealing with Copenhagen, whether we're dealing with Vietnam. Development divorced from its human and cultural context is growth without a soul. So how do we locate culture, museums, as we deal with Copenhagen being the most livable city in the world? What are the indicators? How do we locate museums within the context of quality of life indicators or habitat on which Copenhagen always sits. Copenhagen number 1, Vancouver number 2, Melbourne number 3. And finally, the digital domain. The charter says digitization. We all know what digitization is, but we don't realize that there's actually a digital heritage charter of UNESCO which deals with protocols. Few museum people actually deal with the protocols. And often you digitize human remains, upload them, secret and sacred objects, upload them. The consequences are enormous if you don't think of the ethics of your actions in digitization. Second thing is we always talk about digital access. That's fine. But digital heritage, few of us talk about it. That heritage that's born digital, you know, and so how do we deal with that heritage that's born digital? But the moment we mention digital, we always think it's expensive. Well, here's a guy with $20 computer. You remember Singer sewing machine? His recycled Singer sewing machine and a bicycle wheel. There are lots of them available in Copenhagen. And he's powering away and he's got an antenna. He's using AutoCAD. He's the supervisor of a 7-story building in Mumbai. He's supervising using technology in the cheapest way, and so technology easy, accessible, cheap, but it's only a means to an end, but how do we understand it is critical. And finally, before I pose you the question, I just want you to think about these integrated cooperation mechanisms that we need to establish, more participatory governance structures. It's the governance that's important, not just projects. If you don't have the governance, you can have projects come and go. And deeper statistical understanding, so that what we're doing is evidence-based, as we deal with change and greater awareness of the cultural dimension of human development. And my question is, you have the charter, you have all these statistics, how do you get behind them? Because all of you deal with objects and artworks. This is from the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. And this is the Brian Durrance, some of you know this. Brian Durrance, the curator of Indian collections in the British Museum. Next to him is his object. And it's inside a display case. People are coming, taking photographs. They think this is funny. But that's what we do in our museums is very often, who is behind the mask? Who are the communities? Who are the people behind the mask? Who are the people behind the site? How do we get behind the scenes, if you will? Just like our computers, we use about 5% of our computing capacity through the front end of technologies. But because we don't understand 95% of the technology, the back end, we really don't use our computing capacity to the maximum. It's very minimal. On investment return, we are a disaster, the way we invest in computers. So it's getting behind the scenes. And my question to you is posed by Chinua Achebe, who recently passed away, the Nobel Prize winner from, Things Fall Apart. He won the Nobel Prize from Nigeria. He says, coming out of their skin, how many of you seen a snake in your life? Wow, there must be a lot of snakes in Denmark. I thought only Australia had the most poisonous ones. And the only place where culture is static and exists independently of people is the museum. Even there it is doubtful whether culture really exists. To my mind, it's already dead. Of course, a good curator can display the artifact so skillfully that an impression of completeness or even of life can be given, but is no more than the complete skin which a snake has discarded before going their way, because snakes discard their skins every year. It's within this context, my question to you for the discussion that Son will introduce you to, can you discuss the 10 principles that I just took you through, right, in the charter, and draft 3 approaches that you would take as a group, to transform museums in Denmark as social learning spaces and knowledge generators. But when you suggest the approaches, you've got to give indicators, because it's got to be evidence-based, okay? Thank you.